Okay, so good day or good evening to everyone, wherever you may be joining us today. Welcome to the Intro to Scrum webinar brought to you by Axosoft and Scrum.org. I have a few housekeeping items to go over before we jump into today's presentation. The first one is that this webinar is scheduled to go for 1 hour, with the first 45 minutes reserved for the main presentation and the last 15 minutes reserved for general Q&A. As some of you have already noticed, you do have access to the GoToWebinar control panel. There is a section where you can post your questions. We will be reviewing questions as the webinar goes on. You're welcome to post your questions as we go over certain key concepts, as towards the end we'll be reviewing those questions and trying to see if we can answer those towards the end. This webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be made available in a few places. It'll be made available on the Axosoft YouTube channel, on the Scrum.org YouTube channel, and also it will be sent via email to, so if you register for this webinar, you will get an email 24 hours later with that recording. Let me go ahead and introduce myself. So my name is Jonathan Silva. I'm the Director of Customer Success here at Axosoft. For those of you who are joining us from the Axosoft side, if you're an Axosoft customer, welcome back. It's great to have you. A few notes about Axosoft. We make the Agile project management tool, and we also make another product called GitKraken. If you have development teams who use Git as the version control of choice, then GitKraken is a graphical user interface that helps you visualize what's going on in your repository, who made what merge, who branched off where. In my opinion, it helps reduce the barrier to entry for any team who's looking to implement Git in their organization. But today we'll be focusing on, later in the presentation, I'll go through some examples of how you can implement some of the Scrum framework key concepts that we'll discuss in the main presentation today. And so that gets to the next part here, which is the main presenter. I'm happy to introduce Eric Naver. Eric, hey, how you doing?
All right, thank you, Jonathan. And as Jonathan said, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you might be in the world. Thanks for joining us today. A little bit about myself. I run marketing for Scrum.org and have a fairly long history in software development and delivery. I started my career back in the early 1990s building a data modeling tool as its first product manager for a product many of you may have used or know called Irwin, which has been bought several times and so on. Spent many years at IBM and Rational Software and in other places, always focused on helping developers deliver software more efficiently with greater value. Scrum.org is the home of Scrum. We're run by Ken Schwaber, one of the creators of Scrum. And what we do is training and certification around Scrum, as well as helping individuals and organizations improve how they deliver software by taking Scrum, evolving Scrum, adding capabilities like scaling Scrum through the Nexus framework and so on. But enough about me and enough about us. Let's get started. Oop, went a little fast there. So our agenda today, we'll talk about what is Scrum, the Scrum values. We'll go through the framework, and Jonathan will take you through how do you implement Scrum using Axosoft. So a little brief history. Scrum started because people were having difficulty delivering software with predictability, on budget, the right values, and certainly delivering the right things. Many of us are familiar with waterfall processes, and in a waterfall process, you often start with a whole bunch of requirements up front, and 18 to 24 months later, you deliver something that may or may not be what you expected. Generally doesn't hit budget, doesn't hit on time, and often doesn't meet the requirements that are in the market at that point in time. They may meet the requirements from 18 to 24 months ago, but that's too late. And what Ken and Jeff, the founders of Scrum, Ken Schwaber and Jeff Sutherland, recognized, along with many others, as they were looking at the need to be more agile, is that we need to be able to start delivering value in smaller increments. We need to not gather everything up front, but gather enough to get started and deliver a little bit, and then gather a little bit more and deliver a little bit, and so on. And it doesn't mean we don't have a vision up front for what we're going to deliver, but it means we need to be able to deliver some things, validate those with the market, with our stakeholders, and keep going. So they created this framework. It's not prescriptive, and that's part of the goal. It's really, the idea is it's a framework to help me deliver more efficiently. It's all built here in the Scrum Guide, which is the body of knowledge of Scrum, written again by Ken and Jeff. And that Scrum Guide is short. It's only 14 pages because it's not meant to be prescriptive. What it's meant to do is help you deliver more value more quickly. Now, what is Scrum? As I've said, it's a framework, not a methodology. A methodology has lots of prescription. You do this, and then you do this, and then you do this, and you must follow all of these things. And oh, you better not change that unless everybody in the organization agrees, and so on. That's not the idea of Scrum. Scrum's empirical. It's empirical, meaning that we learn and we adapt, and we organize as a team, and we do the right things based on what's going to make the team successful. My team is very different in makeup from your team and from somebody else's team. And if we all try to follow exactly the same process, generally we won't be successful. It's lightweight and it's iterative, as I talked about. It's about delivering in small increments, generally 1 to 4 weeks. And delivering, now you may deliver multiple times over that period of time, but certainly within that small period. And 3 factors that are really, really critical, in my opinion, to Scrum are these circles you see here on the right: transparency, adaptation, and inspection. What we're doing must be transparent to the team and to our stakeholders. Because if we don't get that feedback, if we don't do what we think we're supposed to be doing, how do we make sure that we're doing the right things? And if we're not constantly inspecting and adapting, looking at how we work and what we're doing, and making changes to improve, how will we get any better? So we'll talk about all of this and how the framework really helps you do that. So the Scrum values. This was actually added about a year ago, it was last July, to the Scrum Guide. And we released, Ken and Jeff released a new version of the Scrum Guide. And the Scrum values were a key component. And as I've worked on different Scrum teams in delivering products to market, I really find these super important, really key to how the team works together. Now, you may look at this and say, oh, this is common sense. Well, yeah, in many ways it is. You may look at it and say, oh, well, of course we do this. Well, if it's not written down, often we forget it. 2, we need to really enforce and live by these values within the team. Because if the team doesn't feel like they're protected by these values, they're going to act very differently. They're going to start worrying about perceptions and worrying about what's around them and so on, versus feeling that ability to really be open, transparent as a team. So the Scrum team must have courage to speak up, courage to do the right things, courage to talk openly and honestly within the team and outside of the team, but certainly within the team as well. They must have focus on the things that they are going to work on, both focus on their individual work as well as the work of the team. A big part of Scrum is this is all about the team. It's not about the individual. We together as a Scrum team are delivering. It's not individual work. Now I'm working on my pieces and you may be working on your pieces, but it's still about the team. We must have commitment to the team, into the work that we're doing. We must show respect for one another, but be open to each other as well, and really being willing to say the hard things, to have those conversations. We'll talk a little bit about retrospectives and how all these things fit into there, but they fit into everything we do on a daily basis. So this is the Scrum framework, and I'm not going to walk through it now because I'm going to touch on each piece. But when you look at this framework, think of this as one sprint. And a sprint is the duration of work. So this is all encompassed in a sprint. One of the things you'll see kind of over on the right, the increment, that thing that's delivered, you must deliver at least once per sprint. Now, delivered doesn't necessarily mean to production, but it must be production ready. So it might be into another environment. Maybe you're in an industry that's highly regulated and you can't just deliver at any point in time. But you can also deliver many times within a sprint that make that increment that gets delivered as well. So it's not just one increment per sprint. That's a Scrum myth I often hear. I've been at presentations where people say, oh, well, we can't use Scrum because we want to deliver daily. And Scrum says you only deliver once per sprint. Well, no, Scrum does not say that. Scrum says you must deliver at least one per sprint, but you can deliver multiple times per sprint as well. And you'll hear me throughout this presentation talk about myths because there's a lot of them out there. And I like to try to address those as they come up. So Scrum is made up of a set of roles, and there are 3 roles within Scrum. We've got the Scrum Master, right? And the Scrum Master's job is to support and help the team. It's to teach the team Scrum and make sure that the team is abiding by the rules of Scrum. It's to help coach the Scrum team. It helps facilitate the work within the team as well, making sure that the team is working together, working well together, helping them overcome dependency issues and impediments and so on. The Scrum Master, part of their job is to also put up a shield around the team to help the team remain focused. So if people from outside the team are coming to an individual asking them to do something that's not part of what's planned in that sprint, the Scrum Master's role is to shield them off and to handle that, maybe through them or the product owner, who we'll talk about in a moment. But it's to really make sure that we're focused and to help them do that. A good Scrum Master over time might have multiple Scrum teams that they're supporting, that they're a part of, because as they teach, as they facilitate, as they coach, they're getting those teams more and more up to speed. They're making those teams more and more self-reliant and independent, and they're able to kind of scale out. The product owner, at the end of the day, is maniacally focused on delivering value to stakeholders. Now, stakeholders may be customers, they may be their senior management of the organization, they might be other folks within the organization, internally or externally, but they're the stakeholders. And their job is to bring that feedback, bring those requirements in, and build out a backlog of those requirements that drive value. They want to do so just in time and make sure that we're providing ROI, certainly to those stakeholders, but also removing non-valuable things. One of the things Ken Schwaber talks a lot about is technical debt. And one, can we avoid technical debt? But if we can, often we can't, is removing that over time, because that just gets in the way. It makes it very difficult for us to continue to evolve our systems and to manipulate those systems as we get more and more technical debt, right? So we want to keep that lean architecture in place, and we want to remove that over time. So part of the product owner's role is not just to look at what do we want to add, but also what do we potentially want to remove. Now, the product owner is ultimately accountable for the product, and they must be empowered to do that. They must be the person that is empowered to decide, make those decisions. Now, do they do these things alone? Absolutely not. Most product owners are going to rely on others like business analysts, the developers, their maybe product managers and so on to get feedback in, but they are ultimately accountable to make sure that we're building the right thing. And they must be enabled to do that. Their job is to prioritize the work. And their job is to make sure we're doing the right things. The last role is the development team. The development team is self-organizing. They work together to figure out how they're going to deliver the work is defined by that product owner. They're going to do forecasts. They're not committing. So when we pull work into a sprint, and I'll talk about the sprint backlog in a few moments, they don't commit to, oh, this is all of the work we're going to do, but they forecast that this is what we are going to be able to do because we're time boxed within that sprint. We're going to get the work done we believe we can get done within that sprint. They transform backlog items, product backlog items, into those increments that we talked about, and they're constantly learning and collaborating. They're working together as a team. And that development team's ultimately responsible for delivering the value. The product owner defines the value. The development team delivers that value in the products that they're delivering. So next are the Scrum artifacts. So the first artifact we'll talk about is the product backlog. The product backlog is, as the title states, it is the backlog of items to be worked on. That product backlog consists of all of the open work that needs to be done. Now, over time, that backlog gets longer and longer, and then hopefully maybe even shorter as we're checking things off. But it's not fully defined at the beginning. We probably have some big items and some smaller items and some things that need to be refined over time. We certainly have at the top of the backlog, those items are pretty well defined and refined down so that we're able to start pulling those in and working on them. But as we're going through, we're constantly inspecting and adapting that backlog. We're constantly looking at that product backlog to add more capabilities and so on based on the vision of what we're looking to deliver. The product owner is ultimately responsible for that product backlog, defining the items within it and prioritizing those. And as I said, they're not necessarily the only one doing that. They may work with product managers and business analysts and others to help create that, but they're the ones ultimately responsible for it, and they're the ones that are prioritizing that work because the product backlog is going to define the value that we're delivering. The sprint backlog is the work that we're going to do or that we plan to do. Remember, not a commitment, the work that we plan to do within a sprint. So, and maybe I should have even reordered this and had some of the events first, but I'll talk about sprint planning and how the product backlog or the sprint backlog fits into that in a few moments. But the sprint backlog are the product backlog items that are selected for a particular sprint that the development team's planning to deliver within that sprint. And I'm pulling those items in, and those items are owned by the development team. And they may be refined further, and they're going to be selected by a member of that team once in the sprint backlog as the work that they're going to do. I'm only going to have one sprint backlog, and that sprint backlog, so if I'm in sprint, in this example on the slide, I'm on sprint 3. So sprint 1 is complete, sprint 2 is complete, I'm now on sprint number 3. I'm not putting a sprint 4 backlog on until I've completed sprint 3. Not necessarily all the work in sprint 3, but the time box of sprint 3, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But we're working through that, we're pulling items in, and Jonathan will actually show you a little bit about how that works as well. The increment is that ship-ready product. It's what we've now developed during the sprint and are ready to deliver. Like I said earlier, I can have multiple releases within a sprint that make up that increment, but I must have at least one increment. I worked on a project, or a product rather, recently, where we were able to, every sprint, release a little bit more capability. And what was important to that, it was amazing. We were rebuilding a website. And at the end of our first sprint, we had a working homepage. So because we had a working homepage, not some document, some JPEGs or something that we could review and say, oh yeah, that looks nice, that's pretty. I think you all show this to some users, they can use it. Well, that JPEG isn't reality. You're not really touching it. You're not really using drop downs. You're not clicking on links. So it always looks good in picture, but then when you actually create it in code, you get a very different opinion and very different set of feedback. So what we're able to do within the first sprint is design, develop, and deliver a working homepage. What this allowed me to do is now share that with some of my stakeholders and get feedback. We were able to touch it. We were able to click on it. We were able to say, well, you know what? In picture, that looked great because the text is set the way it is, and when I scroll, it's still on one page. But then when rendered in HTML on a real website, in a real browser, oh, geez, now we're scrolling forever. The text is overlapping each other. This piece doesn't work right. Oh, this part looks really great. We're able to get that real feedback. And we're able to adjust that in the next sprint, adding new backlog items and so on. So it's really important to do that. Ken tells a lot of stories, and there's some videos on our website that tells some of the stories that he's seen over the last 22 plus years of implementing Scrum in organizations. But I know one story he talks about how they were able, because of this and because of their ability to deliver working software within 30 days, they were able to get feedback. And he was working at a company called Fidelity, and they were able to start building their web-based interface and getting feedback immediately and delivering it much more quickly and delivering functionality that was needed over time, rather than waiting till the end and being late to market and maybe delivering the wrong thing. So the last part I want to talk about and really kind of hit on are the Scrum events. The first event we'll talk about is sprint planning. And I've kind of touched on all these a little bit as I talked about the other pieces, but sprint planning is an event that takes place at the beginning of every sprint. Now, what's really important here, if you remember back to the beginning, I talked about the fact that this entire picture is a sprint. You're always sprinting. So the minute I stop the last sprint, I start the next sprint. So sprint planning is that, I'll call it kickoff in quotes, to the current sprint. And we are now sprinting once we're in sprint planning. Sprint planning is a meeting where we get together with the Scrum team to look at what's in the backlog. The product owner creates their goal for the sprint. And as a Scrum team and development team, we pull items in to that sprint backlog that we plan to work on during the sprint. We'll often do sizing, and there's lots of different ways to do sizing to start to estimate what that work might look like. It also, by doing sizing, helps me see, do I really need to refine this item down into multiple items because it's really, really big and it's probably not defined well enough. It helps me look at those items and make sure they're well understood between the product owner and the development team. It helps me build out what we're going to do. Now, one thing, and I actually was just reading an article that I was quoted in, and there's some misnomers here as well, some myths. You do not need to build out a full sprint backlog to start the sprint. You need just enough work in there to get started. So the article I was reading said that the sprint backlog is built to define all of the work to be done in the sprint. Over time, yes, but at the beginning, no. We don't know exactly what we're going to have. Maybe we can define it all, but we don't have to. We can keep pulling work in, and that's why if we're working together as a team, and because of the transparency in the product backlog, we can keep pulling items in as tied to the sprint goal and prioritized by the product owner. One of the myths I want to hit on here is the comments that I often hear about velocity. I've heard people talk about hypervelocity. It's all about delivering faster. That's not necessarily the case. It's not about speed. Now, speed's important, don't get me wrong, but it's really about delivering value, right? That's why we talk about that increment. That's why we talk about the sprint in the time box of the sprint. We want to deliver value. And if I deliver the right things, we're going to make our stakeholders, our teams more successful. I can deliver a whole lot of garbage fast, and I'm just delivering more garbage. If I'm delivering a lot of value, that's what's really important. And that is really at the heart of Scrum. It's about delivering value. So the next event is the daily Scrum. The daily Scrum is a 15-minute time box. And the goal here is to inspect and adapt daily. The members of the Scrum team or of the development team attend. The product owner can and should, but doesn't have to. The Scrum Master can and should, but doesn't have to. The Scrum Master's job here, or role, is to make sure that the development team knows how to run their daily Scrum and that it happens. The goal is to have it always happen at the same time, same place, every day. Because if you start moving it around, what's the next thing that happens? It just gets in the way, it gets inconsistent. You want it to become a habit. So the goal is to have it always at the same time, same place, same day. And it's a 15-minute time box. It can always be shorter, but we want to cap it there. It's not a status meeting. There's a great video that one of our professional Scrum trainers, Stephanie Ackerman, just videotaped. It's on our homepage of our website talking about how it's not a status meeting. The goal here is the goal of Scrum, constantly inspecting and constantly adapting. Now we're going to look at what kind of work has been happening. Are there impediments? And Jonathan will give you some demo of how a daily Scrum takes place. We're going to look at those things and are the things getting in the way? Is something being blocked? Now, at the end of the day, we shouldn't be waiting for the daily Scrum. If I've got an issue and we can resolve it outside of the daily Scrum, we should do that. Or we shouldn't wait, oh, well, I've got a problem now and it's 9 o'clock and my daily Scrum isn't until 6 o'clock. We should just sit around on our hands. No, let's resolve that. But this is the opportunity for us to talk about the work that's going on, inspect what's happening, and make changes if we need to. This is about inspection and adaptation. And you often hear people talk about the 3 questions. What did you do today? What are you doing? Or what did you do yesterday? What are you doing today? And what's in the way? Well, those are good things to kind of think about as we're having a Scrum, but that sounds very much like a status meeting. So make sure, and it's clearly defined in the Scrum guide, is those are optional questions to help you get started if you don't know where to go and what to do. Let's make this about a conversation. Let's make the daily Scrum about those sorts of things and so on. The next is the sprint review. And honestly, and I think I talked about this in the beginning, I would actually bring the increment inside the sprint review and have the sprint review on the outside, not kind of the way this is drawn here. And there's actually some work we're doing to potentially change that, because the sprint review is not a phase gate for the increment. The increment happens. The sprint review is our opportunity to review the work that was done to create that increment and to review that increment or set of increments that make up that whole increment. The sprint review it allows all stakeholders or those who are available to come and review that. It's not a demo. It's a conversation which will include seeing the delivery, the product. So you can see how the word demo sometimes fits in there, but it's an opportunity to inspect that increment, make sure we're delivering what we thought we were going to deliver, make sure our stakeholders see what we're delivering and provide us feedback. And this happens before planning so that we can now plan our next sprint based on that feedback as well. We may change some of our priorities based on that. But it's an opportunity for everybody to get together, Scrum Master, the product owner, the development team, as well as stakeholders to review that increment and keep that increment and inspect and adapt based on that increment. Understand what we've delivered, understand things that may have gotten in the way, and so on. And that's sprint planning. The last part of our sprint is our sprint retrospective. At this point, we ask our stakeholders to leave. At this point, if there's managers in the room who are stakeholders but are not a part of the development team or part of the Scrum team, we ask them to leave. This is just for the Scrum team. because we really want to ensure that we have the opportunity to be open and honest with everybody in the team. This is where we walk through the last sprint and look at what happened, not from a what did we deliver standpoint, but how did we work together? How might we want to change things? Were there things that were a problem? Was Joe just sitting around the whole time? And maybe we've got to be honest with him about it, right? Do we need to look at how we adapt, how we change our process of working? The retrospective is an opportunity for us to do that. It's an opportunity for us to look at how we're working. Again, if you think about all of this and you go back to what I started with of why did Scrum start? Why has Scrum become so popular? Some people estimate that over 11 million people take part in a daily Scrum every day. Well, why is that? Because if I wait 18 months to start really inspecting and adapting, it's way too late. We've lost it. If I can do this every 2 weeks or every 4 weeks, now I can really start to learn. I can learn about my team members and my coworkers. I can learn about how we're doing things, and I can continually improve on what we're doing. And this is really, really critical if we're going to deliver value back to the stakeholders and back to our business. So this is a really brief overview of Scrum. Hopefully this provides you kind of that insight and so on, as you can see. So I'm going to hand it back over to Jonathan, who's going to take you through some examples of how this can be now automated. Jonathan?
Thank you, Eric. All right. So as I mentioned earlier in the introduction, I wanted to bring some of the concepts that Eric touched on during his presentation, and how can you bring some of these key concepts to life in your organization. And what I'll be doing is I'll be using Axosoft as a quick example. And so for those of you who are Axosoft customers, hopefully this view is pretty familiar. And the first key concept that was covered that I want to go over or highlight that was covered in the presentation is the idea of a product backlog. One of the key concepts of a product backlog is that it will be a list of product backlog items, and these are things that just have to get done in order to push product out the door. If you're building a new product, what do you have to set up the infrastructure? Do you have to decide on, okay, we need a Mongo database here, we need a SQL Server database there, like the nit and gritty of things that need to get done. But then there are also the feature requests that you want to build out. So these are all ideas that the product owner is debating based off of business value that he or she feels needs to be communicated to the team. And then the other major component of the product backlog is that it should be something that's public and easily accessible by your team. So how can someone who's a product owner build out the backlog? How can they make it accessible to the rest of their team members? And there's a way to do that. And I'll just show you real quick how you could do that here in Axosoft. So for those of you who are seeing this for the first time, this is Axosoft. There's just I'm going to keep it brief. I have the organized panel here on the left, which filters all the product backlog items that I see here. Right now, it's a nice short list. And I also took inspiration from one of my favorite films just to build out some of these test items. So if I am someone who's a product owner, I built out a project folder just to help me stay organized. Like, okay, here's the backlog that I'm going to use, but I want to prioritize these items based off of what I determine to be, this item is of higher business value than these other items. So one way you can do that is by going to rank view, which I have here, and it's a stack rank. It's purely based off of position. And what we can do here is take items, so I can promote this unranked item all the way to the top. So now that item 20 is ranked higher than item 7, item 10, item 4. Maybe I want to demote an item, and so make it unranked. So I move item 8 all the way down. And once I'm done, I can go back to a list view, and I can sort by this rank. And so here we have item 20 at the top, then 7, and then so on and so forth. So essentially what I've done here is I've created a list of all these items, and really what you need to just focus on is, I can remember what I mentioned earlier, build out the SQL Server, install Mongo. Those are all just the product backlog item itself. It just shows you that this piece of work needs to get done. And now that I have a list that I can refine further if I wanted to, but I want to make this easily accessible by the rest of my team members. How can I do that? And there's a way to do that here in Axosoft. And it's a lot like, for those of you who remember either writing essays or reports in Microsoft Word, and you remember the save as function, it behaves a lot like that. And so here, I can right click on this tab here, which I have called work items. I can right click and I can save the current tab, which is essentially just like that save as function. I already have a backlog, but I can name it whatever I want, but I already have a saved tab called product backlog that I can select, and I can choose to make this public. So what is this going to do? Essentially, this is going to save this view so that anyone who adds the product backlog tab will see exactly what I see. So for example, I'll hit save, and say I were logged in as someone else, all I would need to do is go to the publicly saved tab section, click product backlog, and it'll recreate that same exact view automatically. So I've effectively shared the product backlog with my team members. They can review the list whenever they'd like. And if they even want to, they can refine the backlog even further. So in this case, I have item 20 selected. I can hit edits. And this is where, you can customize this how you want, but the general idea is as you get more information, as you're collaborating with your development team, you can refine the item and add more data into the item itself, just so that when someone actually gets to work, they have more information on what needs to be worked on. Or if they finally have a good idea of what needs to be worked on, maybe they're finally at the point where they can estimate the item. So those are the two major things I wanted to show for the product backlog.
That's great, Jonathan. Thank you. And when you're thinking about estimation and thinking about this, it's really needs to be a team effort. When you're looking at things, and there's a question that had come in, can you describe a little bit about how planning poker plays, for example? And that's one way of doing estimation. And what's important about planning poker or any estimation, I've seen people use shirt sizes, small, medium, large, extra large, 2XL, and so on. It really doesn't matter what way you do it. If you use a planning poker where you're using different numbers to validate the size of work, what's important is that you're agreeing on it as a team. So that if I think something is an extra large and Jonathan thinks it's a large, well, we better have a discussion to figure that out. Otherwise, we're now not on the same page, and maybe there's something that one of us is missing as to why he thinks it's a large and I think it's an extra large. It also comes over time. So on Scrum teams I've been a part of, estimation's pretty hard up front, but over time, as you start to work together as a team, you start to think more as a team, and you start to realize, well, yeah, what I mean is a large, you actually do mean is an extra large. And okay, as a team, let's come together and bring those together. So I think this is a great way for the team to be working together and sharing information. And one of the really important pieces of this backlog is the visualization of it. We need a way to be able to visualize the work that's planned as well as ongoing.
So let's jump back here to this. I like the slide you have here, Eric, where you kind of show the Scrum framework nicely here. And so what I just covered was the product backlog, but I also wanted to show once teams have gotten to work, what are some things that they can do to, again, visualize and see how things are going. And so there's one way to do that here in Axosoft, and there's one super visual way, and that one is the card view. And I'm going to look at a specific sprint that I've already planned. So here I have sprint 1. And this is pretty nice here because I have a card view, and I'll even zoom in a bit. Let's see, here we go. And so here I have just some of the product backlog items. My team members have already gotten work to it. I'm at a point where I want to take on another product backlog item. I have the availability, I have the skill set. I can take on, say, this item number 16. So I'm going to pull out the organize panel again. And this time I'm going to pull out the users and team section. And here I am. Here's me. And I'm just going to take this item and I'm going to take it. So here it changes to my avatar here. It is now on my plate. And it's just a matter of me diving into it. I can look at the description, the requirements, based off of conversations my team has had with the product owner, and I can go ahead and get to work. And then as I'm making progress, I can move the item just by dragging and dropping it over to the appropriate workflow step. And then if I'm just interested in seeing how everyone else is doing just at a quick glance, one way I can get that information is just by grouping by the assigned to. So I click this here in the upper right, and then once I hit assign to, I see just based off each user, how things are going for them just quickly at a glance. It's nice to see the swim lanes. It's nice to see where their items are. In case this needs to be, and in case there's a conversation I want to have during the next daily stand-up.
Yeah, and this is great, right? This now gets to more of that visualization that we just talked about. What you're seeing here, and part of what Jonathan's doing is, I assign work to myself. Someone does not assign work to me because we are a team. We're working as a team. Now we may have a discussion as to who may do what, but at the end of the day, I'm pulling things from the backlog in that I'm going to work on. One of the big discussions that often happens as part of Scrum team is something known as WIP, right? Work in progress, and making sure often that we don't have too much work in progress as individuals. If I have 5 things in progress, now I'm context changing all over the place, which just slows me down and makes me less effective and less impactful. So that's something that's usually discussed at retrospectives and at planning. It's part of maybe even our definition of done, as to how much work in progress can one individual have. And this is a great way to start to visualize that as well. You can see here that that same person has 3 things in progress. Admiral Priat, right? So that might be a conversation we're going to have at the next daily Scrum, to talk about, well, Admiral, it's great that you're working on all the things, but you've got 3 things in progress. What's going on? How are you going to complete all 3 things if you're working on them at the same time? And maybe it's because they're really 2 of those 3 are complete in his mind. They're just waiting to be implemented into the build so that they can be ready for testing. And the third one is the one that he's really working on. But we don't know that just by looking at this, but we could see that in the notes in other ways.
And then the last one that I'm going to go over real quickly here is the daily Scrum. And so as Eric mentioned earlier, this is a conversation that you're having with your team. You're looking to communicate, inspect, adapt, make changes as needed. And we have just something here to help facilitate that conversation. So here I am again logged in as my user. And I have a scratch pad here in the bottom right where I can make some notes. And so I have, some quick notes. Maybe I've discovered some impediments and I wish to communicate that to my team, but I want to jot them down now so I don't forget. And then once I have jotted down all the impediments, let me go ahead and mark this to be used for the daily Scrum. So what does that mean? So to help facilitate that conversation that you might have on a daily basis, we have the daily Scrum here in Axosoft. And when you launch it, you can start a timer to help you stay in that 15-minute time box. And this is just here to serve as a visual cue as you are having those discussions. So if I jump to me, for example, here you see if I've logged any work, if I've reported, hey, I've done this much work, it'll be over here on the left. And then you can quickly see anything else that's on my plate. But the most important part is the notes that I have down here at the bottom. So when it is my turn and I do want to share how things, what's going on, I can share that, hey, I've encountered these 3 impediments. Let's talk about it, or at least start the conversation. And if we need to continue the discussion offline, we can go ahead and do that. And so that's just real quick. This is just meant to be put up on a conference room projector, or on a monitor, or just somewhere that everyone can see. And again, it's just meant as a reference, because the most important part of the daily Scrum is the conversation that you're actually having from team member to team member.
Great. So I think this is awesome. I think what we're able to show here, what Jonathan's really able to show, is how do I now take Scrum and apply it, right? And that's why those examples are important. So we're going to get the question. Whoops. we're going to get the questions in a moment. I think there's some really good ones out there. Just in a nutshell, kind of summarizing what we just talked about, a team commits to delivering working software within 30 days or less. A time is scheduled to show that software, the sprint planning. I'm sorry, the sprint review. The team creates the software. Right? This is a team effort. It's a team approach. And the team offers their work up for inspection and adoption during that planning as well. And then you constantly do that. This is a constant, right? We repeat, and we rinse and repeat, and we rinse and repeat. So I think this, hopefully you'll learn a little something today, and you'll probably learn a lot more from the questions. Sometimes I find that Q&A is the best way to hear, because you're hearing what others are thinking. Jonathan?
All right, so it does look like we have a very engaged audience. I see lots of questions posted here. So let me take a look at a few here. Let's see. What is a PBI?
So a PBI is a product backlog item. So you could think of it maybe as a requirement. It's an item that's sitting in the product backlog that's been not necessarily refined, but over time will be refined into likely multiple product backlog items. So it's what Jonathan showed in that first demo.
And then a follow-up question. And then, folks, so now that we jumped into the Q&A session, you're more than welcome to post questions as we go along. We'll try to answer as many of them as we can. We have one question that came in earlier from Srivasta asking, who will place the items from the product backlog over to the sprint backlog?
So during sprint planning, the development team will bring items in from the product backlog into that sprint backlog as part of the work that's happening during sprint planning. And during the sprint, they may pull additional items into that sprint backlog. The sprint backlog is a definition of work planned for a particular sprint.
Okay, and we have another question from, I think, Katie or Kate. I apologize if I mispronounced that. Does the daily Scrum have to be the first meeting of the day?
No, it doesn't. Let's work at what's right for the team. I'm on a Scrum team, for example, which has people in multiple time zones. So we do it in the middle of my day, which is the morning for folks who are, I'm on the East Coast of the US, which is the morning of the folks on the West Coast that are on that Scrum team. So you need to make it so that it's something that's available to all Scrum team members or development team members.
And then there was a follow-up question from William Griffin asking, what do you mean by 15-minute time box for the daily Scrum? What happens if questions come up during that 15 minutes and do you need to stick to the 15-minute time box or extend the meeting?
That's a great question, and one that comes up quite often, William. Let me give you a couple pieces to that. One is, if I schedule an hour meeting, we always find ways to fill the hour. If I schedule a 15-minute meeting, it makes us be succinct. So the idea here is, let's cover what needs to be covered in the Scrum, or in the daily Scrum, and then we can have action items that come out of that for follow-on meetings. In my Scrum team that I'm on today, we call those post-Scrums. So if something comes up and you can't see me, but we'll put up a little hand signal with two air quotes above our head called, as rabbit ears, and say we're going into a rabbit hole here, right? We're going too deep. The whole team doesn't need to be involved in this. Let's take that offline and let's make it a post-Scrum discussion, which could happen immediately after. It could happen later in the day. But the whole goal here is, let's keep this time box of 15 minutes so that we're succinct and focused on just what is the work that's happening today, were there any issues, and how do we learn from each other? And then anything that doesn't really have to impact the whole team, we can take that off as a side item. But really try to stick to that 15-minute time box, because if I give you an hour, I promise you will fill an hour. It's amazing. In a post job, I used to schedule all my meetings for 45 minutes instead of an hour. And it was amazing how we always were able to finish in 45, and the people who had the hour meetings always finished in an hour. You always find ways to fill meetings if it's there.
And then we have a good question here. What are some tips for coaching stakeholders, especially the non-technical ones, who want a complete perfectly working product out of the gate. How do you get people who are used to waterfall type management practices to buy into Scrum? And that was from Andrew.
Sure, Andrew, a great question. And there are a lot of techniques out there for doing this. I often start with find me a product that was delivered right the first time and by following a waterfall process. So I'll ask that question, right, and look through how that and start down that path, because what often happens is you get people who just like the command and control much more than, oh, we have to define everything up front. And I'll talk about that, and I'll give real concrete examples of projects that started with lots and lots of requirements and what we actually ended up being delivered at the end and how those didn't meet the needs. And I've got a lot of examples. I'm sure you have examples that you can pull from your history, your work history, that you can use. And then I talk about the different ways that we can do this differently, right? It's not about not delivering something in the end. It's about delivering things incrementally over time so that we can always review, inspect, and adapt. And I think if you go to your stakeholders and talk about that piece, that's really, really helpful. I mean, I've gone to stakeholders and said, well, you remember that project you worked on at whatever point, or give me a project where everyone went off into a black hole and showed up 3 months later with what you didn't want. And almost every stakeholder's had that experience. I've had that experience. So I talk about that and then say, hey, what if every 2 weeks or every 4 weeks, we came back to you with what we've done. You can actually play with it a bit, and then we can continue to improve on that. And in another 2 weeks, we'll deliver some more. And another 2 weeks, we'll deliver some more. So you're constantly being able to make those changes, and we're able to incorporate your feedback, right? Make it about them, not about you. We're able to get your feedback and incorporate your feedback, and that's also very helpful.
Another question we have is, if you do not follow the Scrum Guide 100%, are you still doing Scrum? So that question is from Vadim.
Yeah, so no, right? The Scrum Guide is the definitive definition of Scrum. It's less than 14 pages. As we just talked about, there's 3 roles, the events, and that's it, right? So if you're not following Scrum, are you doing Scrum? No. You might be doing pieces of it, and there's a lot of people say, well, we do a daily stand-up, so we're doing Scrum. Well, no, number one, I know a lot of people who can't stand up, so you just insulted them by calling them that. But I don't care about that piece. I don't care what, but if you're not doing all of those pieces, you're not doing Scrum. Scrum is defined in the Scrum Guide, and there's one Scrum Guide, as defined by the creators of Scrum, Ken and Jeff. So if I'm only doing pieces of it, no. Now, am I going to inspect and adapt? And I'm sure this is where you're going with that question, because am I going to add things to it? Absolutely, you're going to add things to it. But how do I inspect and adapt if I don't do a retrospective, if I don't do my planning, if I don't do my review? I can't if I don't do my daily Scrum. So it's about abiding by those artifacts, abiding by those events, and abiding by those rules. Beyond that, have at it.
So speaking of adding items, we have one question from Jeff asking, how would production issues or hot ticket items be addressed in the Scrum process? Would those be added to a current sprint and just ranked the highest?
That's up to the product owner, right? It's the product owner's job to prioritize those items. So if you have items that are hot tickets, you should be working with your product owner to prioritize those. They may have to bring it into the current sprint. The website just crashed. I'm going extreme, but yeah, let's get on that right away. They may need to bring those in, but they're going to prioritize the work because they're prioritizing the value, and they're the ones ultimately responsible for and accountable for ensuring that value occurs. So you bring those to the product owner, they're going to prioritize those in the backlog and work with the development team to make those happen, which actually ties to one of the first questions that came up. So I think we could probably address this as well at the same time. Can a sprint be canceled at any moment, and who will be the decision maker in that case? So yes, a sprint can be canceled. It can only be canceled by the product owner, because a product owner, again, is ultimately responsible and accountable for that sprint or the work that's going to be done, while the development team is the one responsible for doing that work. So only the product owner can cancel it. And that's an extreme event. You don't just randomly cancel a sprint, but it does have to happen at times. And it's only if you feel like you cannot achieve that sprint goal because the sprint goal has changed. So the business has changed. We just got acquired. Something traumatic happened, whatever. That's a product owner decision to cancel that sprint. So I wanted to address that because they kind of tie together.
And then we have Julie asking, while using Scrum, how do you suggest we answer senior management's question about schedule, i.e., when is it going to be done?
Sure, that's a great question. First question I ask is, how do you normally handle that? Because I've been on many of these projects where every month we had a review, and every month we were 6 weeks away or 6 months away. And next month we had that review and we were 6 months away. And next month we had that review and we were 6 months away. So I address that by saying, here's what we plan to deliver in the next 2 weeks, 4 weeks, whatever our sprint length is. And here's what I plan to deliver in these next 2 to 4 weeks. Excuse me. I also talk through my vision. So I have a vision for what this product is going to be. And I can do some estimation on that, but again, it's just an estimate, no different than if you did all of your requirements up front and estimated out when you were going to deliver on that. There are a lot of books out there on software economics and software estimation, and all of them will say anything more than about 6 weeks you can't predict. So you can go and build out all the requirements and get all the contracts in place and all of that and say, okay, we're going to deliver this in 18 months. I can pretty much guarantee you will not deliver what was in that requirements backlog in 18 months. You'll deliver something maybe, but it's not going to be what was in that backlog. So now if we want to say, okay, what are you going to deliver in 18 months? Well, we'll deliver something that's working software that meets the stakeholder needs. But I'm not going to tell you exactly what that is, because I can promise you our requirements will change over that period of time. And we're going to learn as we're building over that period of time. But if anyone's had a project that delivered exactly on time, exactly what was defined on the budget, they're kind of miracle workers.
Okay, so we're reaching the top of the hour here. There are so many good questions here. I do appreciate everyone who posted those in. As we mentioned earlier, this webinar is being recorded, and we will have the recording up and ready to go, hopefully within 1 business day, up on our respective YouTube channels. We do invite you to subscribe to Scrum.org's YouTube channel, to Axosoft's YouTube channel. You will also get the follow-up email tomorrow with a link to the recording. So thank you so much. Thank you, Eric, first of all, for such a fantastic presentation. And thank you, everyone else, for taking the time out of your day to join us. It's been a pleasure having you, and I think we can adjourn this webinar. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, folks.